Hey everyone, it's Marvin. Thanks so much for listening to Books and Boba. I just wanted to take a quick second to remind you that Books and Boba just launched our Patreon to help support our future endeavors. Rira and I have been running Books and Boba for the last 6.5 years, and we've always talked about wanting to do more, including expanding our content offerings, being able to go to book events and do more coverage. And so to help us get closer to those ambitions, we started a Patreon to help us grow and to better support books by Asian and Asian American authors. We are offering 2 tiers for our Patreon. The first is our regular Boba member coming in at $3 a month, which will give you access to our brand new Books and Boba Discord server so you can engage with your fellow Books and Boba Club members and also Rira and myself in real time. This is where we'll be aiming to move the bulk of our book club discussions, but rest assured we'll still have a presence on Goodreads as well. And our premium tier is our Honey Boba member tier coming in at $5 a month, where in addition to access to our Discord server, you'll also get access to our monthly Boba Chats, a bonus podcast where Rira and I and some guests will get together each month and have a more casual discussion on stuff that may or may not be book related, as well as answer some listener Q&A. Honey Boba members will also have access to a poll to help decide an official Books and Boba book pick once per quarter. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, support Books and Boba on Patreon by going to patreon.com/booksandboba. As always, Rira and I really appreciate your support. All right, thanks for listening, and I'm on with the show. Hey everyone, it's Marvin. This episode of Books and Boba is brought to you by Audible Theatre Presents Good Enemy, a world premiere play by Audible Theatre emerging playwright Yilong Liu, directed by Obie Award winner Hye-Young, about a father who learns that closing the door to his past means shutting his daughter out. Good Enemy deftly weaves together the stories of 2 generations and 2 countries, the US and China, both during times of sweeping social changes, exploring the power of human connections. This smart, thrilling, and hopeful show features a road trip across America, theatrical flashbacks to 1984 China, action, suspense, secrets, discussions of generational trauma, and the bonding power of TikTok. The show stars Obie Award winner Francis Jue, who was previously seen on Broadway in Pacific Overtures as well as Soft Power at the Public. Previews for the show have already begun at the Minetta Lane Theatre in New York City, and it will run for a strictly limited 5-week engagement through November 27th. Tickets are available now at goodenemyplay.com. And for Books and Boba listeners lucky enough to be in New York at this time, we have a special treat for you. If you use the code BOBA25, that's BOBA 25, all caps, you'll be able to unlock a special discount on your tickets. Specifically, if you purchase tickets through November 5th, you'll be able to unlock $25 tickets using the code. And if you purchase afterwards, you'll unlock a 25% discount. Again, the play is running through November 27th at the Minetta Lane Theatre in New York City. You can buy tickets at goodenemyplay.com, and don't forget to use the special Books and Boba discount code BOBA25, all caps. And if you do manage to catch this play, please let us know what you think on our Goodreads forums. Thanks again to Audible Theatre Presents Good Enemy for supporting Books and Boba. And now, on with the show.
You're listening to Whoa! Potluck.
And hey, you're listening to Books and Boba, a book club and podcast featuring books by Asian and Asian American authors. My name is Marvin Yue.
And I'm Rira Yu.
And we are here today to discuss our October 2022 book club pick, The Hole by Hye-Young Pyun, a psychological thriller about a man who finds himself at the mercy of his mother-in-law. Rira, happy November.
Happy November. Yes, we are coming to you a little bit late, folks. We did have some scheduling issues, and we did do a lot of author interviews. So apologies that we couldn't make it to the end of Spooktober for this discussion.
I mean, technically, we're still the week of the end of Spooktober, so We're still hitting our intended release week, just a little bit late.
Okay. Yeah, just a little bit.
Just
late.
a little bit. But yeah, as always, when we discuss our book club picks, we're going to be discussing the entirety of the book, including plot spoilers and twists. So if you have not read the book yet, we recommend you to go read it first. It's a pretty quick read, only like about 200 pages. Or if you listen to audiobook, an easy like 2.5 hours if you listen to that 2x speed.
That's because we're insane.
I listen to podcasts at 1x, but I listen to my audiobooks at like 1.8 because...
Oh, that's funny. I listen to our podcast at like 1.5 speed, and usually other podcasts, it's double speed. So I listen to everything at double speed.
You see, I mean, it's all on everyone's individual preferences. For me, I like listening to my podcast as intended, but when I listen to audiobooks, I don't like reading with my ears at a slower pace than I can read with my eyes. So that's kind of,
Well, I read this book through audiobook, and I have to say, I kind of wish that I read it through a physical copy because I heard that
there's some visual stuff on the video.
Yeah, there's some
right?
visual stuff that happens. And
I know.
And this book actually has a lot of subtle details, and I missed a couple, so I had to like look at author interviews to see like if there's anything that I missed. And,
I know. I also listened to this book on audiobook, and I read that there were some like visual cues that were on the page, and I was like, I mean, the Kindle version's only like $14. I can probably swing that, but I I controlled myself and my spending this one time. But let's just get into it then. Rira, do you want to start us off with the book jacket description?
All right. Ogie has woken from a coma after causing a devastating car accident that took his wife's life and left him paralyzed and badly disfigured. His caretaker is his mother-in-law, a widow grieving the loss of her only child. Ogie is neglected and left alone in his bed. His world shrinks to the room he lies in, and his memories of his troubled relationship with his wife, a sensitive, intelligent woman who found all of her life goals thwarted except for one, cultivating the garden in front of their house. But soon Ogie notices his mother-in-law in the abandoned garden, uprooting what his wife had worked so hard to plant and obsessively digging larger and larger holes. When asked, she answers only that she is finishing what her daughter started. So this book came out in 2016 and was immediately a bestseller. Hye-Young Pyun is a very well-known author in Korea. And this book was originally a short story for The New Yorker, and it was called Caring for Plants. I'm sure it wasn't originally published in The New Yorker because I think it got translated and then published. But
Probably,
yeah. So it's really interesting because I read maybe the first half of the short story, back when it came out, I think. And I was like, oh, this vaguely sounds familiar. And it turns out that it was pretty much the same intro for this book.
Yeah. I mean, I came in pretty cold. All I knew was the basic boilerplate that we've been giving on our podcast, and that it was our Spooktober pick. And I guess, you kept warning me that it's not actually a spooky book, but I kept thinking it might get spooky anytime now because the story is it's super unsettling, right? The entire time, everyone's keeping secrets from each other, including the main character. And I found myself, even listening to the book, feeling tense throughout the entire thing. It was a really good thriller in that aspect.
Yeah, for people who jumped in cold, I guess from the opening, you'll think that it's a ghost story because the first thing that Ogie sees in the hospital is his dead wife hanging from the ceiling, staring into his face. And you're like, oh, is this a ghost story about a vengeful wife haunting him? It's like, no, that's the only time when the ghost shows up.
I mean, figuratively, it might be
figuratively,
that, right?
yes, but it's not a ghost story. It's a thriller and a very claustrophobic one. And it doesn't really feature any classic horror stuff, but it is horror in a sense that it shows the monstrosity of humans.
Yeah, it's horror in terms of Misery as a horror film, right? Like a film about.
Speaking of Misery, yeah, it gets compared to Stephen King's Misery quite a lot.
Yeah, it's like Misery, but like taken to an even further extreme, right? Because the main character isn't just injured, but like completely disabled.
Yeah, yeah. I kind of wish that I was able to read this book in its original language because there's a lot of wordplay. Even just from reading the English version, I was like, oh, I know what this is in Korean. Like Ogi, the main character's name, it actually means refusal to give up, like stubbornness. And like that was like a very purposeful name that the author like gave him because he is persistently trying to escape his mother-in-law's imprisonment. And also like the title, the whole in Korean, it's just called hol, and that is like the I guess like the Korean version of whole in pronunciation wise.
It's like a romanization, or no, like reverse romanization.
Koreanization, Hangulization. I don't know, but so whole can mean like the Korean pronunciation of whole. It also is the prefix for solo, like being alone. It's also referencing widowhood. And of course, you know, holes in one's life, emptiness. That is like a major recurring theme in this book. So, and there's like more wordplay. Like there's a paragraph about the word 자기, which is an endearment that couples use. It also means oneself, and then means darling. And it also means like pottery. So there's a lot of wordplay, and I heard that that is Hye-Young Pyun's style of writing. So I was like, oh man, I wish my Korean was better.
Yeah, I mean, we just interviewed Anton Her, the translator of I Want to Die But I Want to Eat Tteokbokki by Baek Se-hee earlier this week for an interview we'll be releasing next week. But we talked all about like how hard it is to translate things like that. And I know that specific term you mentioned, the jegi, was something that this translator agonized over, like how to translate that term to English.
Yeah, yeah. And I was just like, because she pretty much like briefly explained the different definitions in the book. And I was like, oh, in the Korean version, you probably didn't have to like explain it. It's just there. And I was like, oh, it must have been so hard for her to contextualize that for Western audiences.
Yeah, but that being said, listening to the book, I didn't feel like I was listening to a translation of a foreign language book. Like I think she did a really good job translating the dread and the tension and even the language of the book. And this book has a lot to do with language communication, what one says and what one doesn't say. I don't know about you, but I got a lot of like Kafka vibes from it, especially like Metamorphosis, right? Like this man wakes up one day in a body that he does not recognize, right? And everyone also starts seeing him differently. And I definitely got some of those vibes as well.
Yeah, yeah. The thing about Hye-Young Pyun is, this is kind of a spoiler, she writes a lot of toxic men in her books. So like when Ogi is talking, like because this is kind of in his perspective, it's written in third person. There's a little bit of distance between the protagonist and the reader. However, it's written in his perspective. You know, he's kind of saying like, oh, I have like a successful career as a college professor in this very obscure field. Like I was still loving to my wife who was a failure at everything.
He says that a lot. Like I want to count every time he mentions that his wife is a failure at everything, because it got like, are you okay, dude? Like,
I mean, in the beginning, you just kind of give him the benefit of the doubt that like he is like a normal, ordinary person who was probably a good husband. But honestly, he is the fucking worst. And just from knowing that Hye-Young Pyun writes toxic Korean men in her books, this is her fourth novel. So I was just like, oh, Yeah, he's probably not as good as he says he is. And also, he is the only named character in the book. And because this is written in his perspective, I'm like,
Well,
okay, how
besides his
self-centered
friends
are
and his
you?
mistress.
No, I mean, they're not real names though.
Really?
It's yeah. Yeah, he's the only character who is named. Like the names that he gives his friends, it's like S.K. And I'm like,
Oh.
those are just initials. That's not even their names.
You know what? I think because I listened to this audiobook, I missed that part and I just assumed his mistress's name was just J, like Jae, which can be a Korean name.
It's definitely a common Korean nickname. But yeah, I was like, he's the only named character. He's so self-centered because he's all he talks about is how great he is, and once he, recovers, how he's gonna like get back his tenured position. And I'm like, your wife died. Like, why does it seem like you don't care about her at all?
He did suck real bad, especially when he's describing why his wife failed at a lot of things. And it's because, well, she stood up against the patriarchy and was punished for it. Like, he acknowledged that she was being discriminated against, but he never took an active role in any of that. It was just something that she had to deal with because, that's what she chose to do.
Yeah, I mean, his wife was put in a very isolated position because she, is having trouble with her career. And, it's pretty ironic that she is unnamed in the book because all she wants is to be to be good at something and to be remembered for it. And you don't even get her name at the very end. So the isolation, that just reminded me of a lot of Korean women, especially like older Korean women, maybe like boomer generation, because so much of the patriarchy has just like suffocated them and they just have to, endure whatever position that they're shoved into, which is usually like working, like being a housewife, only supporting their husband, them not having their own identity other than the relationships that they have with men. It freaking sucks. And you totally see how, she's like completely dependent on Ogi in terms of like income. And that is a struggle that a lot of Korean women used to have. Now there's a lot of Korean women in workplaces to a point where incels and the far right are trying to dismantle the Ministry of Gender Equality in Korea. And they're like, women are taking over our jobs. They should go to the military. It's a whole thing. But anyway.
Yeah. I mean, Ogi himself tries to justify it being like, does he justify? I mean, he talks about his tragic upbringing and how like he's overcome that by not thinking about it. And
yeah, I mean, you see a bit of like his like where he got his toxic masculinity from, and it's from his dad, who's like, "Oh, why are you studying? Why do you want to go to college? Be a man, like make your own money." And I was just like, okay, well, I feel like this is really weird because in Korea, education is like put on a pedestal and people judge you by what university you go to.
And wasn't it his wife that made him go to grad school in the first place and like is responsible for him being where he is now?
Yeah, and she was going to get her master's, and it kind of sounded like she was supporting her husband, and therefore like her like efforts into getting her master's like declined. And I'm like, wow, that's a common story. How many women have pushed the career aspirations of their husbands in at the cost of their own.
Yeah, and the interesting way that this is, and I like that how in the book all of this is background information, right? It's stuff that you pick up because the main narration is still told through the perspective of Ogi, and Ogi's world revolves around himself and what he needs and what he wants. And so I think it's definitely a book where you're constantly reading between the lines.
Yeah, yeah. And it's funny because like we talked about the visual cues in the novel, and the visual cue that neither Marvin and I experienced while reading this was at the corner of the page there is a black hole, and it's like pretty small in the beginning of the book, but it gets larger and larger as you continue on into the chapters until it like completely swallows the page. And that kind of mirrors what we go through as readers when we're reading about Ogi, because everything is from his like one perspective of just like, oh my God, how tragic. He lost his wife and now he's disabled and paralyzed. Like it's going to be a really hard recovery. But then we get more and more information, and like our perspective expands as we continue reading the book.
And he kind of digs himself into a bigger and bigger hole, figuratively.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we start off being super sympathetic, and because here's a guy who just went through a terrible tragedy, lost his wife, is disfigured, lost control of his body, and it's just in a very pitiful state. But the more we learn, the more we have to wonder, like, did he bring this on himself?
I mean, regardless, I don't think anyone deserves what he was put through by his mother-in-law. And let me just say, I think that is just a horror in itself, being completely dependent on your in-law. And you add that extra layer of, oh, I killed their only child, or at least, like they died while I survived. It's like, oh, that's another layer of, I don't want to be completely dependent on you.
And then you add to the layer that there were marital problems that you eventually find out. And that the wife, and that, like we mentioned, he had a mistress. The wife probably found out because there were all these clues that she knew. And then you have to wonder, does the mom know? And
she does know, because she finds notes that her daughter had like left behind, because her daughter was like documenting all the things that were going bad in her marriage. And we don't get what she actually wrote in her notes, but we know that her mom found those notes and she's like, wow, my daughter was really unhappy in this marriage.
Well, yeah. I mean, he's wondering that, right? And then he's also wondering, okay, so is all this stuff that she's putting me through, is this revenge? Is this actually one of those Korean revenge stories, right?
I mean, we do retribution pretty well in our storytelling.
I mean, we all know Koreans can hold a grudge.
Oh, yeah. We serve it hot. Yeah, with his mother-in-law, she's an interesting character, because when he is introduced to her, she's like completely guarded. Like he has no idea what she's thinking. And he finds out that she's, half Japanese, mixed race. And he's like, oh, that's why. And immediately writes her off as a foreigner. And anytime when she does something that he doesn't understand, he's like, oh, it's because she's Japanese. And I'm like, wow, what a Korean xenophobic way of thinking. And of course, that's like a messy...
it's a messy relationship to begin with.
Yeah, because like Japan colonized Korea. So there's a lot of anti-colonial feelings. But you find out that his mother-in-law, she like went through a lot. She was separated from her birth mother when she was like in middle school because her father, who was Korean, decided to remarry to a Korean woman, and she got ripped away. And yeah, like it would make sense that she would be so loyal to her only child, because really, like, that's her only family, because her husband is also garbage.
How much of that was, I mean, obviously it's toxic no matter how you look at it. It's a different type of toxic where he's trying to like literally measure dicks with her daughter's new, was he her husband then, or just they were together?
They were about to get married.
Yeah. And he's like trying to like prove his manhood against her daughter's new husband throughout this entire like dinner. And yeah, like on one hand, you can read that he's being protective of his daughter. On the other hand, he's kind of, yeah, he was totally a jerk too. And at this point, we know, even though Ogie does not admit it, he has an inferiority complex, right?
Yeah, 100%. And, like because he is an orphan, because his mother's death is presumed to be a suicide, there's a lot of stigma that is attached to his, I guess, like family. And it makes sense because in Korea, like bloodlines are a very big thing. So, when you're dating someone who doesn't have family, it's just like, oh, like that's a little bit sketch. Like we don't know like what kind of family that this person was raised in, what kind of genetic problem that they may have. And it's just like, it's so
right. It's the whole
it's
like,
so toxic.
well, if he's from a good family, why is he an orphan? Or if he's such a good guy, why is he an orphan? He must have done something to deserve it, right? Like,
yeah, and it's also just like, oh, how did your dad die? Oh, was it like it was liver cancer? Well, what if your entire family has a history of liver cancer? And I'm like, so what? Almost every family has a history of cancer. That's how most people freaking die.
Yeah. Yeah, that was one of many uncomfortable exchanges in this book. I think the most uncomfortable one is actually the one where Ogie's mother-in-law invites his coworkers to the house.
Oh yeah, that was really humiliating. Yeah, so like what happens in the book is she actually, does hire a caretaker and a physical therapist after he is discharged from
what did
hospital.
You make of the fact that she, in between kind of being sinister, is also super caring and nurturing, right? Like kind of concerned about Ogie's recovery.
But that's only in the beginning, though. That's in the beginning before she kind of discovers the marital problems, because gradually she gets rid of the caretaker. She says, oh, like this physical therapist is too expensive. So he's going to not come like every day. He's going to come like once a week. And that's not how physical therapy works. And like, as you go further into the book, she isolates him completely. No one visits him, not even his physical therapist. There's like no way for him to actually recover and get better. And he's just counting down the days until he can get his surgery. And even that gets taken away from him because his mother-in-law says, oh, isn't it ironic that, your surgeon got into a car accident? Well, your surgery got pushed back like by 12 weeks. And you think that she's lying, but at the same time, it's like plausible enough.
I was more thinking, did she sabotage the surgeon's car?
No, like, okay, so it could go both ways. It can actually have happened, and it just sounds, it just sounds sinister coming from her. Or because you find out that there was a time when Ogie's wife, like when she was trying to get pregnant, for the IVF procedure, her original doctor got into an accident and she had to go with a different doctor. And she decided to pretty much like get the procedure done as scheduled, but with a different doctor. But that different doctor turned out to be a creep, pretty much. She felt very uncomfortable and violated. And she was like, I'm never going back. I rather not have a baby. So it's a situation that happened before. And he was like, oh, is this like revenge? Because that's kind of what happened to his wife. And it's just like a subtle jab of like, yeah, like I know
true.
Everything that happened.
Yeah, I like that reading better. I like that reading of she is just like, I actually didn't realize that she must have found whatever his wife left behind in the process of his recovery. And that's why she suddenly turned into the evil mother-in-law. Or not evil, but the avenging mother-in-law, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, everybody in this book, their motives are questionable. They're not good people. But really, like, what defines a good person. Everybody has like their own skeletons in their closet. And can you really blame the mother-in-law for feeling vengeful? You can blame her for being a shitty caretaker and being neglectful.
You shouldn't abuse disabled people or someone who can't defend themselves. But at the same time, as a parent, you're allowed to feel resentment for having to take care of the guy who made your daughter's life miserable, I guess.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a very gray area. I'm not endorsing
this
abuse
book
of
is
any
very,
kind.
very gray. This book is very, very gray. Actually, it's like Obie plants the seed in our minds as a reader. Like, oh, his wife tends to exaggerate and she'll remember events differently. And you're like, well, she's documenting all the things that, all the transgressions that happened in her marriage life. How much of it is real? How much of it is exaggerated?
Especially since we've seen that Obie himself rationalizes everything away in like ways that benefit his point of view, right? His standing.
So we should probably talk about the treatment of the disabled in this book, because that is like where most of the horror lies.
Yeah. I mean, obviously Riri and I are not physically disabled. So, and I don't think the author herself is neither, right?
No, she's not.
But I think imagining what it feels like to have a body that doesn't listen to you anymore is pretty horrific in itself. And I know it's some people's actual lived experience. And not to get ahead of ourselves, but next month's book club pick, we'll delve into one of those lived experiences. But you can really feel like the frustration of not being able to react to the things around you and people who take advantage of that.
Yeah, I mean, being paralyzed is, it's a terrible experience, but I think a lot of the horror comes from other people, like how they treat you when you're disabled. Like his original caretaker, she's, treats him like a baby because, she changes his catheter and his bedpan. And, she like cracks jokes at his expense. She's like, oh, you're not talkative today. And it's like, okay, I guess you think you're so funny by like making jokes about his inability to speak. And he's like unable to like protect himself too. So that's like also really shitty. And then you have the fact that like he can write sloppily because, his, I think it's his right hand. I don't remember which hand, but it still has some mobility. However, that means of communication is taken away from him. So really the horror is unable to stand up for yourself, being seen as invisible or as a child, and being unable to express your thoughts. And those are things that could kind of easily be fixed by other people, but they're not giving him those opportunities.
I'm sure there's a metaphor there, right? It's probably like the things that he prided himself in, right? The things that he was able to overcome prejudices of being an orphan or, his ability to take care of himself, that all gets taken away. But somehow his toxic masculinity remains, right? Because he spends the entire book saying, I'm still the best. I'm when the like, look, I can move my leg 1 centimeter. I'm recovering. I'm going to go back to work and I'm going to be just as great as I used to be. And he spends literally the entire book with that mindset, which on one hand is a sign of his perseverance, but on the other hand is his inability to rely on other people. It's
also arrogance, 100%. I mean, he was arrogant before the accident and he's still arrogant. It's funny how you're mentioning how, he thinks of himself as great because he overcame his like orphan background. But he does have an inferiority complex, like you mentioned. The house that he lives in with his wife, it's actually a townhouse with a yard. And when I read that, I was like, damn, like how much money did you spend? Like Korea is, the land price is so expensive and everybody lives in apartments. So they're kind of seen as aspiring. And when he invites his colleagues for BBQs in his yard, it's a way of him showing off, being like, look at how well off I am. Oh, by the way, like this is how much I had to get a loan from the bank, but it's still humble bragging. And, you know, he also has tenure. He, like, just because he went into a field that's, like, not relatively well known in Korea. And it's just like, oh, look, I made the smart decision of switching specializations. And now I have this treasured position, which he didn't even get fairly. So...
I love that part of the humble brag is, check out how great my credit is. I can get such a huge loan that I have to pay off the rest of my life.
I mean, I'm sure people are wondering why the wife started gardening all of a sudden.
Yeah.
It might seem like she was suddenly obsessed with it because she does go through obsessions. And I just kind of laughed because you find out that he had an affair with Jay. I already had my suspicions, but I was just like, oh, right. He totally had an affair with one of the colleagues. And then she was like, no more barbecues, and decided to just raise the entire yard for her gardening project.
Yeah, I mean, this was like the first of the major twists, right? And it comes about very subtly, right? Because for the first, I want to say probably a third of the book, you assume that he's torn up because he lost his wife. They had this great relationship. They had this great marriage. You know, she defended him against her father. And then there's that one scene where he has access to his phone and he calls someone. And you realize, I mean, that's your first clue that there's something else going on. Because it's not made explicit who he's calling, but it's obviously he's calling someone who he has a pretty deep relationship with. Like, what did you think about that scene where he picks up the phone and calls, like, his mistress, presumably?
I already knew that he was a toxic man and probably had a mistress. I kind of assumed that he had a mistress, especially like when there's a line in the book. Let me pull it out. It was, the 40s were ripe for sin. And there were two basic reasons. Either you had too much or you didn't have enough. In other words, the 40s were when you found it easy to do bad things out of power, out of anger, or out of feeling left behind. So I'm like, this is someone who, thinks he is in the position of power because he has like this position as a tenured professor. I'm like, yeah, why wouldn't he think that he deserves someone more successful, better? And you kind of see there's a line where, like, when they're having barbecue, that one of his colleagues got drunk and he, helped them onto the couch. And you don't find out till later that colleague is Jay. But like when I read that scene, I was like, oh, it's totally a woman colleague, isn't it? And his wife totally saw him like being gentle with her. That was just kind of like my brain being like, it's like a toxic Korean man. Like, what are some toxic things that he can do? Being like cheating. And I was just like, it was just kind of there in front of my face. But for people who, I guess, weren't reading too much into it, because this book is a lot of like reading subtle hints.
Well, he also justifies it that like, oh, we didn't do anything. But it's like, it's not that you didn't do anything, but like the emotional cheating was definitely there, right? His thoughts were definitely not pure at that point.
Yeah, and he also cheated twice because he had a relationship with a student. And he like not justified, but he like begged for forgiveness, not to his wife, but to his mistress, being like, oh, it was like a one-time thing. They like one thing led to another. And I'm like, dude, you're like in your 40s and you're like coming on to a student. Like, it doesn't matter. That's gross.
Yeah. And I think, this is also when the mother-in-law starts turning, right? She discovers that he made a call. And the horror in Ogie's mind when he realizes why she would just hit one number, right? One button to make a call. And it's like, oh, she must be redialing. And I wonder what she knows. And that's when the psychological battle of wits begins.
Yeah. Was that like before she called the colleagues over?
No, yeah, it was before.
Okay, so that's why she called like everyone over and kind of did this humiliating
Emasculated him
scene.
in front of his colleagues, right? Because she literally changed his catheter in front of them. And, I'm sure we all know what catheters are, right?
Yeah.
It's a thing you stick in the place where the
You
pee
pee.
comes out of. Yeah.
Yeah, so she's like changing his catheter. Like they see his, penis. They see like the urine, and he's just, it's like the humiliation of his mother-in-law, like doing that with his bare hands is like doing that with her bare hands is it's a lot. Especially she did it on purpose because she always wears gloves whenever she handles him. But like when she was in front of the company, she was like, I'm gonna use my bare hands to make this as mortifying as possible. And you kind of realize that she knows more than she lets on because she's talking about widowhood, and she says, "Oh, you know what? The best thing about being a widow, you can fuck whoever you want, and your dead spouse can never cheat on you anymore." And you're like, "Oh,
I wonder what
okay."
the Korean was for fuck.
I don't know. I don't know. This is why I wish I could read the Korean. I heard from an interview with Sora Kim Russell, the translator, that one of the things that she wished that she would be able to go back and kind of add more details is the ivy that grows all over his window.
Yeah.
So like the word in Korean that she uses, the word in Korean that's used to describe the ivy growing is tokada. And tokada can mean tenacious, which is kind of what she went for in the translation, but it could also mean poisonous. So I'm just like, toxic masculinity literally represented in a plant pretty much.
Yeah. This is making me sad that in translation, some of these double meanings are lost. And there's no shade to the translator. I'm sure she did the best she could. It's just some things that are hard to translate. But I did like that when the wife made this garden, like his one thing was no climbing vines. He's like, okay, but did it anyways.
Oh, but she did it in a sneaky way. She planted them at the back of the house. And she's like, oh, he's never going to see it because it's at the back of the house. But that's the room that he ends up in as someone who is paralyzed. And slowly, like his view of the world, his only view of the outside world gets covered out by this ivy. And I heard that Hye-Young Pyun's novels, it always features like nature being very,
Petty.
I guess, not petty, but hostile to the men in her book. And I wonder if it's just like a commentary on how a lot of the times like nature is related to the mother or like the feminine energy. I'm
Right.
talking
And
like,
masculinity is all about taking control of nature, manipulating nature, and like
yeah.
bringing it down, bringing it to, or what's the term? Making it bend to your will.
Yeah, and here is, the one plant that did not die from his wife's hand that is, consuming him.
Yeah, I mean, you said in the beginning that this isn't a ghost story, but it's a ghost story. He's being haunted by the ghost of his wife.
I mean, it is terrifying also because, he has nowhere else to go. So he's constantly like replaying memories and he's alone with his thoughts. And I'm like, wow, solitary confinement. That is a
Yeah.
horror that anyone can imagine.
And you would think he would reflect on all the things he did wrong. And like, I mean, he slowly gets to her, right? Like the book ends on what I assume is an epiphany that he's a piece of shit. But as the story goes on, he starts unraveling and like kind of breaking his facade of being like the most awesome husband. When he starts to think about all the ways that he let his wife down and all the things that they did just couldn't communicate with each other. And which culminates in, I guess, reliving the night of the accident and what actually caused the car crash that killed his wife and left him disabled. And you realize that, and you know, he alludes to throughout the book that had they had made it to their destination safely, his mother-in-law might not even be his mother-in-law anymore, right? Like this was a relationship that was at its terminal point.
Yeah. I mean, she wanted a divorce, and he was like, I'm not going to give it to you. And, you know, she tried to, you know, blackmail him, being like, I know what you did to not get your position, but to secure your position, because you find out that he was a shitty human being who was like, I'm going to purposely slander my colleague, saying that he had an affair with a student, but he justifies it by saying, oh, but it was like kind of true. He was coming on to students. So like, it's not like I didn't say anything that was untrue. Like he would have gotten like, you know, fired or demoted anyway. And it's like, but you did that for absolutely no reason. He literally says, sometimes another person's failure is insurance. And I was like, you did that for absolutely no reason. Not even for moral reasons of like, oh, he is a predator.
Yeah, and it makes you think like, how much was he actually also gaslighting his wife, right? Like calling her a failure, like not supporting her dreams and her ambitions as well. And he ends up being that guy anyways, right? And, you know, we learned that the hotel they're heading towards is one of his love hotels.
Ugh. Gross.
Yeah.
But we find out that, you know, his wife kind of like has this moment of impulse when he says, oh, I'm not going to give you a divorce. Like, what are you going to do? Like, you can't live by yourself. I'm the one who's bringing all the money. Like, I am the one who has the house. You have nothing. And she jumps on him and takes control of the steering wheel, and he pries her hands off. And that's when they rear end a truck, and then they tumble off the guardrail and onto like off the hill. And, you know, it's like, I guess in his mind, he was like, oh, like, it's not my fault that she died. It was like, it was almost like she was trying to kill herself. Like, it's like, you missed the entire point, dude. But okay. So I mean, the title of the book is called The Hole. And the hole in this book is the hole that his mother-in-law is digging in the garden. And everyone mentions it, being like, yo, it's a really big hole in the garden. Like, like, what is she trying to plant? I mean, she says that it's going to be a koi pond, but is it really going to be a koi pond? And she says, oh, it's like, I want to have something that is living in this house, because, you know, the garden was full of dead stuff. And I'm like, are you... It's like, are you sure you want to see something living or to watch something dying in that hole?
I was still in like horror mode. It's like, is she like murdering everyone that he's come in contact with and putting them in the hole? Like, is the doctor in there? Is Jay in there? Like, what's going on? Why is this hole so big?
I also like the part when like the physical therapist comes over, and, you know, like, he's like, Obie at this point is in a really bad state because his mother has now like completely neglected him, like failing to feed him for a number of days, change him, and, you know, get rid of his bed sores and all of that. And the physical therapist is like, you need to take him to the hospital. What do you mean you have not taken him to the hospital? And you're just like, okay. Like, she definitely is not taking him to the hospital until he's at a point where there is no recovery.
Yeah.
And it makes you think like, oh, like, was she planning to keep him alive, but barely alive for the rest of his life? Or was she planning to kill him from the beginning by burying him in this hole?
Maybe she was trying to keep him alive until she finished the hole. Because there was that one scene in the middle where they mentioned the surgery and how there's a chance he might be able to recover. And he notes that she has a look of terror on her face. Like, what do you mean he'll get better? And that was confusing for a while until you as the reader realize that she already knows.
I think it's interesting that like we keep saying like, oh, he dug himself into a hole, and pretty much like at the end where he has a little bit of mobility and he's like crawling out of the room and he goes into the garden. His mother-in-law shows up, and he notes that like she's not strong enough to drag him back to the room or do anything with him. So he tries to escape regardless, but she kind of like shuffles him towards the hole. But it's essentially his fault that he falls into this hole, though. So it's just like, oh, okay. Like, it's kind of funny that he was afraid of this hole that he fell into himself. A situation that could have been avoided if he wasn't also a bad husband. And
this is following his, the physical therapist comes and he's so excited to show him, look, I can move my leg like a centimeter to the left. And then the physical therapist just says, oh no, bro, that's nothing. that's just being paralyzed, man. And I wonder if this is when his like breakdown begins, when he realizes that he really is in the hopeless place. Because the very next chapter is the one where he drags himself out of bed and into the hole. And once he's in that hole is when he finally has this epiphany that maybe he is a piece of shit.
I mean, like, this book talks about like emptiness and isolation. And when he's in that hole, he's like, oh, maybe like all the, emptiness that my wife felt in her life is because of me.
Yeah,
and
maybe
the ending
I'm
of the
baddie.
At the ending of the book, he kind of has a memory of his wife reading a story about a man who almost has like an almost death experience, a near death experience. A steel beam like falls down like millimeters away from him, and he realizes, oh wow, I could have died, and decides to just leave his life behind. Like, doesn't bring any belongings, doesn't tell his family. He just leaves. And his wife, who, is just like, what happened to my husband? Oh my God, like foul play, blah, 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 blah. She hires a detective. And she finds out that he just moved to another city and just started over again. And Ogie's wife is very emotional about this. And Ogie's like, what's wrong? It sounds like, I mean, he's so lucky. He was able to survive and, he's like living his life. Like, why? Like, are you upset because, you think that I'm going to leave you? I'm never going to leave you. And she starts crying. And to me as a reader, I'm like, she's not crying because she's afraid that you're going to leave her. In fact, she wants you to leave her so that she can restart her life. Because she feels like everything that she does is a failure because he constantly tells her that, she's unable to amount to anything. So I was like, okay, well, he finally got it at the end when he's in the hole.
He said something like, if you die, I'll die with you or something like that?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, and that's how the story comes to a close. What do you think, Rira? Does the mother-in-law fill in that hole with Oki in it?
I mean, at this point, yeah, because like he's not going to be able to crawl out of it. I think a sick thing that she might do is that she just leaves him there and she doesn't like bury him. And then, she like goes to the authorities and being like, oh my God, I like left the house for like an hour and all of a sudden he's here and he fell and it was an accident. Oh no.
Crime.
The perfect crime. But we did have some comments in our discussion thread. Nina said, this is one of those books that I'm very glad will be discussed in the podcast. Very dark and hard for me to process what each character's motivations are and their deep lack of empathy.
Well, I hope we helped with that. I don't know. I'm not sure.
I don't know if the mother-in-law, the mother-in-law definitely was not empathetic to Ogi and his
Well, she was at first,
disabled.
and then she became vengeful, and obviously it's presumably because she discovered his shittiness. Like, discovered that he was a shitty husband to her daughter and needed him to suffer for it.
Yeah. I mean, she's not a good person.
Oh, yeah. I mean, obviously the lesson taken from this book should not be you should abuse disabled people if they're bad people. I mean, no one deserves to be
No one
neglected
deserves
like
that kind of abuse. Actually, around the time when this book got published, I heard that there was a protest for more accessibility for disabled people in Korean subways. And one of the things that they did was they would put a wheelchair in the middle of the tracks, and the train would have to stop. And it's like, and it was pretty much them saying, "Oh, you can't take the train? Well, we can't take the train either because you guys refuse to see us as, also human beings who should be able to have accessibility to public transportation as well."
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, it could be a commentary on how shitty society is to disabled people in Korea. But, this is a problem that America has as well. I think it's even more of a bigger problem in America than it is in Korea in terms of accessibility.
I mean, it could be
especially
both,
with
right? Because
healthcare.
it could be both, right? Because you have the example of the mother-in-law who's obviously doing it for revenge. But you also have the son of the caretaker who just abuses Ogi because he's there and he can't do anything about it. So you do have examples of like the callousness of how some people don't see disabled people as human or fully.
Yeah, and even when his colleagues show up, like, they have conversations without him because they're like, well, he can't talk back, so what's the point? So they pretend that he doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Which is unfortunately a struggle that a lot of disabled people go through. Another comment that we got is from Catherine. Great pick for October. The imagery of the vines climbing and covering the window was very creepy to me. Yes, same thing for me. The story reminded me a bit of The Vegetarian, the similarities between the wife characters and how the story is built around a character we get third-person view of. What Ogi is put through is obviously terrible, and the humiliation scenes were unsettling to read. He sucks, parentheses, not justifying what happened to him, close parentheses, but I could understand, parentheses, to a point, close parentheses, how a mother-in-law in her grief wanted some type of revenge. Yes, I agree with almost all of your points. I have read The Vegetarian by Han Kang, and there is definitely a similarity in the wife characters. They are treated very poorly by the patriarchy, and they do want to be able to have a space of their own, and it kind of manifests through plants. It's really interesting because The Vegetarian is written by a different author.
Yeah. I love how everyone is of the same mind that like Ogi sucks. He doesn't deserve what happened to him, but he definitely sucks, and you can't really you can't fault the mother-in-law for feeling the way she does. And it really is just, it's motive, means. This whole book essentially is the prequel to a murder mystery, right? The sequel to The Hole will be when the quirky detective comes to solve the unearthing of a body in this backyard.
We can only imagine. But essentially, this book is about people with power and people without power, and the people with power will always use it to corrupt themselves.
Yeah.
I mean, we see it with Ogi, how he, uses his position to advance his own ambitions, and we see it with his mother-in-law, who is using her power to keep him disabled and to steal his autonomy, pretty much, or whatever is left of it.
Yeah.
But that was our discussion of the whole.
Yeah, a great pick.
I'm sorry if we
month.
didn't explain a lot of the things that happen in the book. Like I said, I read this through Audible, through an audiobook.
I think we did a pretty good job. I think we were pretty thorough. I mean, I think we did a pretty good job describing the themes. I think, yeah, we did great. We're like Ogie. We're awesome. We're so good at discussing books.
Listen, I said this before, there are a lot of subtle details that you could totally miss, and a lot of this book is reading between the lines. Since I read this through audiobook, I missed a lot of those details, so I had to resort to looking at interviews and analysis and, comparing notes and stuff, seeing what I got right, what I got wrong. So I too struggled.
Which, to be fair, is how you should consume media, right? Read the book, have your own takes, compare it to what other people say, develop those thoughts and bring it to this podcast. Yeah, good job, us. I think we did great. And that's not being toxic, I hope. All right. Well, now that we're in the month of November, what are we reading for book club?
Like we mentioned earlier, we are reading The Year of the Tiger, An Activist's Life by Alice Wong. Alice Wong is the founder of Disability Visibility, and this is kind of a memoir, but mostly a collection of essays. It's about her journey in becoming an activist and what it means to be disabled and also a person of color. So a lot of the art that is in the book, they are commissioned art by disabled and Asian American artists. Yeah, it's kind of a nice surprise that we're reading this right after the whole.
Yeah, it's almost as
I didn't mean for that to happen. Let me just say that was a coincidence. That was not.
Let's just
not
call
what
it
I had planned.
Serendipity, synchronicity. Let's call it just a fortunate occurrence.
Well, but this is our first nonfiction in a very long time. I think the last nonfiction we read was Good Talk by Mira Jacob, and that was a graphic memoir. So, yeah, we can always use more diversity in our reading.
All right, we'll be discussing that book at the end of November, so you have until then to get your thoughts into your Goodreads forums. As always, we love to include the thoughts of our members in our discussion whenever available. And yeah, that'll do it for this episode of Books and Boba and our discussion of The Whole by Hye-Young. Thank you all for joining us again, and we hope to see you all next time. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to Books and Boba. This podcast was hosted by Marvin Yue and Rira Yu and edited and produced by Marvin Yue. Follow the book club on Twitter and Instagram by going to @BooksandBoba and engage with us on Goodreads on our Goodreads group. You can also check out past episodes of the podcast by going to booksandboba.com and by subscribing to us on your favorite podcast app. Don't forget you can support Books and Boba and Asian American authors by purchasing books at our bookshop.org account. Check out the link in our show notes and also at booksandboba.com. Books and Boba is a proud member of the Potluck Podcast Collective, a collective of Asian American hosted podcasts featuring unique voices and stories from the Asian diaspora. Learn more about the collective and check out our fellow Potluck shows by visiting the website podcastpotluck.com. Thanks for listening.
Hey, I'm Phil Yu, and you may know me from a blog called Angry Asian Man.
And I'm Jeff Yang, author, journalist, and celebrity dad.
We host a podcast called They Call Us Bruce, an unfiltered conversation about what's happening in Asian America.
Each week or so, we host a discussion about some of the most vital and interesting topics in our pop culture and our community, bringing in guests who are shaping and informing this thing called Asian America from Hollywood to D.C. and beyond.
We got media, entertainment, food, family, politics, representation.
The good, the bad, the WTF of it all.
So check us out wherever you get your podcasts or at theycallusbruce.com.
Peace.
Peace.